Hello, everyone, and welcome to the talk presented by the Department of Philosophy of Ateneo de Manila University for the Roque J. Ferriols Resource Center for Philippine Philosophy. My name is Anna Maria Avicilia, an instructor in the department, and it's my pleasure to introduce another talk in the series where we highlight the work of Filipino philosophers. Today's lecture takes up an important question. How should national identity be taught in post-colonial schools, such as those in the Philippines? Our speaker is Dr. Rowena Azada-Palacios, Assistant Professor and Coordinator for Graduate Programs in the Department of Philosophy at Ateneo, and her work sits at the intersection of education and critical political thought, with a focus on the forms of domination that appear in different educational contexts. In this talk, she discusses her award-winning book titled Postcolonial Education and National Identity, published by Bloomsbury Academic in 2024. In it, she rethinks how national identity is taught in post-colonial schools, drawing on the thought of Hannah Arendt. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy this lecture by Dr. Rowena Azada-Palacios.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your interest in my work. Thank you to Dr. Rodriguez, Miss Avicilia, and uh, shucks, Wilsel, what's your surname? And Mr. Adriatico. Thank you to Mr. Adriatico. Miss Avicilia and Dr. Rodriguez for the invitation. And I'm really delighted to meet the whole class. And thank you for your interest in my work. While I was preparing for this talk, I was debating with myself about how much detail to give. It's my first solo authored monograph, so I'm not yet super accustomed to talking about a full book length project for an audience. Usually, if you're just giving talk about a paper, then 20 to 40 minutes is enough to give the key elements of the argument. But this is a much longer work. It's 9 chapters long. Some of the chapters can have quite detailed arguments. So there's both the individual arguments of each chapter, but also the much larger overarching argument. And I was debating with myself about what to focus on. In previous book talks, I've decided to just excerpt and talk about individual chapters, 1 or 2 chapters. But because the interest is in the book and not just in specific chapters, I decided to talk about this book by giving an overview of how the book came to be, how the work came to be, and then just talking about a general overview of the scope of the book. And then perhaps later on in the Q&A, if anybody's interested in some of the more detailed arguments, I'd be happy to talk about them. And of course, you can read the book, right? It's available in Rizal Library, both physically as a digital copy. So, the book is titled Postcolonial Education and National Identity. This was actually my PhD project, which I finished in 2021. So that's 5 years ago, almost to the day because I submitted it in April. So it's like 4 years and 11 months to the day that I submitted it. Um, it was published in 2024, so obviously this was pandemic times, and so there was some delay in getting it published. It finally came out in 2024. It took a while to find the right series as well. Um, and then, although the publishing date, if you look at it on the inner page, it officially says 2025. I think that's because the actually, no, the print version came out in 2024, but for whatever reason, they counted it as a 2025 publication. So it's been out for a little more than a year. When I started my PhD, I knew I was interested in two questions because these were the questions that had motivated my two master's degrees. So I have two master's degrees. My first is in philosophy, and my second is in citizenship and history education. And I already when I was thinking about my PhD project, I was already envisioning this project to build on the questions that I had been asking in my master's degrees. So my first master's degree was in philosophy. I had written my thesis with Father Demike as my supervisor. Um, And for that degree, I was really interested in Hannah Arendt's political thought. I was just so captivated with the way that she wrote, with her insights. I would be reading as an undergraduate. I would read Arendt and just be like nodding and writing yes in the margins, every other paragraph. And so I really developed this interest in her work. So when I wrote my first master's thesis, I focused it on the question of how she how she struggled with the question of how a diverse community of people, not only with different identities, but also with different individual thoughts, perspectives, opinions, can all live together in peace, right? And in harmony. She was writing, of course, in the run up to the Second World War. She herself was a refugee who escaped Nazi Germany. And then, of course, those experiences shaped the rest of her career as well. And so this continued to be an important question for her in the decades after she escaped from Germany and became eventually an American citizen. So that was the first question. Arendt's how Arendt deals with the question of diverse people living together in society. And the second question was a question that I had explored in my other master's degree. So I did a second degree in citizenship and history education because I knew I was also interested in that, but I wanted a little bit more background in education because I didn't have a prior degree in education. And so for my master's thesis, as they call it, in the UK, which I did in at the Institute of Education, which is the Education Research Institute of the University of London in the United Kingdom. For that master's thesis, I wrote about the question of multiculturalism in education. So, the issue that was underlying my thesis was about national identity and how in a multicultural society, um, usually the account that people have of national identity is an account that actually doesn't squarely fit with people's experiences or not everybody's experiences. So when I was in grade school, there was a certain image of what Filipino is, but actually it's a very Tagalog centric understand or Luzon centric understanding of what Filipino is, and it doesn't necessarily fit squarely with the histories, the personal experiences of people, not only from other parts of the country, but also immigrant Filipinos as well. So I had gone to Chinese schools through most of my grade school and high school life. And so I knew that my friends considered themselves Filipinos, but their understanding of what it meant to be a Filipino, their personal history, for example, didn't map onto the descriptions in our textbooks of mga ninuno natin, right? Because mga ninuno natin was not their experience of their ninuno. And their story wasn't actually told in the textbooks about national identity in the Philippines. So I wrote about how Chinese Filipinos specifically and I wrote about Chinese Filipino identity specifically and national identity more broadly and how these were portrayed in citizenship education textbooks in the Philippines. And by that I mean the official Araling Panlipunan and Social Studies textbooks that were used in public schools. So those were the two questions that I was asking in my master's thesis. And these then fed into the questions that I wanted to address in my PhD dissertation, or as they call it in the UK, PhD thesis. So, as anyone who has written a long piece of theoretical work knows, in your own theses, master's theses, you know that at the beginning of the project, the questions are still not very clear. And at the beginning of the project, you just have a broad idea of what you want to write about, and that begins to take much clearer shape as you move along the reading and writing involved in your project. And that's what happened to me. So I had these two ideas: identity, cultural and national identity, and then Arendt. And I wanted to bring these two together, and it's through my conversations, of course, with my supervisor, my conversations with my upgrade panel. So in the UK, the proposal panel is called an upgrade panel. So these were, I'll name them just because I should acknowledge their help. So my supervisor was Paul Standish. My upgrade panel lists were Tristan McCowan and Paul Morris, and other colleagues and mentors at my university. Slowly, I was able to create the argument that gave shape to the book in its current form. Okay, so I'll talk. I'll describe the book as having three main parts. Funnily enough, this isn't how it originally looked. So in my early outlines, um, I actually began with Arendt's educational thought, because being trained as in a philosophy department, you're trained to start with a philosopher. But in conversations with my panelists, we realized that might not actually be the best approach. And so the first part is actually the part that I wrote second, which is the post-colonial analysis of national identity. And here is where I essentially try to shed light on the fact that the way that national identity is portrayed in a lot of the academic literature doesn't coincide with the way that national identity is experienced by people, especially in post colonial contexts. So I'll just give a very brief anecdote about this. Many years ago, at the philosophy department, we had a colleague who was from Austria. And over lunch, we were talking about the question of nationalism and national identity. And he was talking about how in Austria, the idea of national identity or nationalism is really frowned upon. And you really shouldn't talk about it because, of course, they think of nationalism as being connected to their history of, Nazism, right? And so it really struck me that in the one context, to say that you're nationalistic can seem like something so horrific, and it can seem like something that would necessarily lead to injustice, and it would necessarily lead to oppression, whereas in our context that's not how we have depicted nationalism. So nationalism in the Philippine context has actually been usually associated with justice and liberal ideas. And so I wanted to argue then that national identity is understood in a very different way if you're coming from a post-colonial context. And so I drew on a lot of post-colonial thinkers to make that argument. And so that was part one. And then part two is where I then engaged with Arendt's educational thought. And I had to justify this because Arendt clearly is not a post-colonial thinker. But I made the argument that because of her own experiences of marginalization, her own experiences of speaking as a Jewish person who had survived the genocide against the Jewish people that was done in 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 Germany and in the wider German occupied Europe. She had some insights that I think were also relevant to another set of marginalized people, which were people who had been affected by coloniality. And so I decided to zero in more specifically on her educational thought, which is a very narrow aspect of her work. So I focused most specifically on two and a half texts, but also I had to draw on a wider range of her thought to explain the ideas that were in those two and a half texts. Um, So that's where the middle part is the part which is much more exegetical, much more hermeneutic, and that's where I talk about Arendt's thought much more closely. And then the third part, which that's where I kind of bring it all together, and I talk about how this post-colonial analysis of national identity and Arendt's educational thought can be brought together to think about its implication for how national identity is talked about in schools. And it's here where I develop this idea of schools as cultural playgrounds, schools as places where we can play with or where children can play with the idea of what their identity means. So I'll talk about each of these sections in a little bit more detail. So part one, the post-colonial analysis of national identity. Um, I drew I had to decide how to talk about this with depth, but also in a way that is applicable to the post colony in a more general sense. And in conversation with my supervisor, the way that I decided to approach this was to talk about the Philippine case. Obviously it's the one that I know the best. It's the example of a post colony that I know the best. So I did a little bit of history here. I did a bit of historical analysis when I tried to spell out by using the case of the Philippines how identity has actually been used as a tool of colonial oppression, really, and how identities have been used in order to perpetuate a kind of colonial legacy, and how these colonial legacies continue. So I talk. It's been a while, so let me just briefly try to recall what I say about this. Um, yeah, so I talk about how the whole concept of national identity in schools, it's a fairly recent concept. As I think most of us here probably know, the idea of a nation is a recent concept. It's only about 200 years old. The idea that you have a nation that somewhat maps onto a state is also fairly recent. That's also about 200 years old. So when we're talking about a nation state, we're talking about a very recent conceptual invention. And so I talk about that and how that then affected the age of imperialism, such that, for example, when imperial powers colonized different territories around the world, they tried to create a kind of hierarchy of civilization based on the degree to which nationhood mapped onto statehood. Right? So a country, for example, like the Philippines, composed of various cultural identities, various ethno-cultural groups, was seen as a country that was less civilized because it didn't have a single identity that could map onto its territorial borders. So the less you were like a nation state, the less you were modern, right? And so I talked about how this was evident, for example, in American colonial policy as well as in educational policy. I talked about how this idea played into arguments about language and why the Philippines needs to just have one national language rather than multiple national languages. Ironically, of course, as we know, European countries frequently have multiple national languages. Switzerland is, of course, the best example of this. But for some reason, when European colonizers went to their colonies, they insisted that, a multiplicity of languages was a sign of backwardness. So I talk about this in the historical chapter, which I call the ideological roots of identity building in post-colonial schools. And then I talk about what an alternative might look like. So in my next chapter titled Postcolonial Foundations for an Education for National Identity, I present an alternative way of understanding national identity that does a couple of things. First of all, it parses more clearly and distinguishes more clearly between concepts like national identity versus what is it? Partiality versus to identify as something doesn't necessarily mean that you are partial to that. So I could identify with being Filipino but also hate being Filipino. So national identity is not the same as nationalism, right? So I parse those concepts in greater detail, and then I draw on some post-colonial authors who have written about identity to develop this idea further. So I use, for example, Homi Baba and this idea of hybridity to argue that the experience of the post-colony when it comes to identity is one of hybridization. Interestingly, in a lot of 20th century Philippine discourse, this is seen as something problematic, right? And even now, you'll still hear commentators saying things like, oh, as Filipinos, we don't know who we truly are because we're a mix of everything, as if that's a bad thing, right? And there's some kind of like romantic idea that, if we can go back to our pre-colonial roots, then somehow that will be where we will find true Filipino-ness. Now, a lot of post-colonial writers, such as those from South Asia, have long criticized that view. And Baba is one of those people who is able to make an argument to defend the creativity and the creative power of post-colonial hybridity. So all of these ideas, I inform the chapter that I write about these post-colonial foundations of national identity and proposal that we think about national identity differently. Um, the next part, wait, let me, okay. So then I kind of um uh step on a different track altogether. And in the next section, which is composed of three chapters, this is where I then leave the post-colonial question behind and I focus now on my exegetical and hermeneutic um, work with engagement with Hannah Arendt's thought. And I try to so in the Arendt scholarship, there's a lot that's been written about Hannah Arendt and her ideas of education, which are a little bit simplistic. So I kind of have to wade through a lot of this and try to clarify a lot of oversimplified aspects of Arendt's thought in the secondary literature. And so what I do here is I really engage with close readings of Arendt's educational works, clarifying some of the misconceptions that people have about Arendt, particularly her idea of the social. So one way that Arendt is often quoted is, but they use Arendt in the way that she criticizes the politicization of schools, which she did in a series of very controversial essays for which she was vilified because she criticized the forced integration, the mandatory integration of schools in the Jim Crow South, right? So in the states that still had segregation. And clearly she was vilified because she seemed like she was on the illiberal side of the spectrum. But I argue that even though, we might continue disagreeing with Arendt to this day, her arguments were actually very careful and actually very nuanced. And I try to draw out those nuances and try to see where Arendt's arguments might actually have some elements of strength. And that requires then me really, going through this, quite detailed analytical account of what she means by the word social, and how she situates the role of schools as this really kind of liminal space between the private and the public, and what the implications are for this special space that schools have. And in the course of this, she's actually trying to navigate the tensions and questions about identity and children's identity within those schools, right? So, when she was writing about the mandatory segregation or mandatory integration or desegregation of public schools in the US South, she was, of course, talking about racial identities, but she was also drawing from her own experiences, having been forced, of course, to study in a Jewish school and not having any, um, interaction with Christian German students when she was growing up, and her, and the kind of like, I suppose the the ambivalence that she experienced about that, because such schools then are a haven of safety for minoritized children who would have experienced abuse and oppression in a more integrated space. What integrated, of course, in quotation marks, because it's not true integration, right? But then also how then she uses these reflections to think about, well, what is the cultural role of schools? What role do schools play in helping children understand both their own culture, which could be a minoritized culture, as well as the culture of the larger society, including the majority culture more broadly. So that's what these three chapters are about. I also don't completely agree with Arendt. So the third of the three chapters there is kind of like a criticism of some of her thought as well. So the final part, the last two chapters are when I try to bring all of this together and talk about the educational implications of this. And my goal here is to really try to think of how Arendt's ideas about culture, but also the post-colonial ideas about identity might be brought together to think about national identity in schools in a much more creative way that doesn't lend itself to oppressive um, uh, minoritizations of margin or non-dominant identities in schools. And so I talk about how classrooms might be considered cultural playgrounds. I get the idea of play from a an intertextual reading of two works which at first glance might not seem like they fit together. But the first is a French philosopher by the name of Barbara Cassin, who talks about language and nostalgia. And then the second text, which I draw into this conversation, is from the late great Vicente Rafael. So he recently passed away, he just passed away a few days ago. And Vince's work, in which he comments on Nick Joaquin's work on language. And so I take these two texts, one French text, one Filipino text, and the way that these two texts try to problematize the question of what it means to have a mother tongue, right? What it means to have a language, both from a viewpoint of somebody who isn't from the post colony, for whom language is simple, right? To be French is to speak French, but then who wrestles with the question of language as somebody who travels a lot versus the question of language from someone like Vince Raphael who has a native language that was basically banished from educational institutions for many decades and so therefore has been forced to speak in a language that is uncomfortable to his tongue, right? So, and this is Vince Raphael struggling with the question of like speaking English and writing in English. So I use this metonym of language to think about how, for a post-colonial person, this is also how national identity feels, right? You're taught to think of a certain national identity, but it doesn't sit squarely with you. And so how do you navigate this? And the way that Vince Raphael navigates this in terms of language is by referring to Nick Joaquin's work on slang and on Taglish. And he talks about how Taglish is really a form of resistance. Um, it's a way in which the oppression of English in the classroom is fought against by people on the street. And they fight against it by being playful about it, right? So you're taught all of these strict grammar lessons in the classroom, and then you go out and suddenly you can treat English as an equal and you can play with it, you can mess around with it, you can flip the words around, use it ungrammatically, and no one's going to tell you that that's wrong. And that's how Taglish slang develops or Engalog slang develops, right? And so I use this idea of playfulness surrounding language to think about how in classrooms, maybe this is how we can also think about national identity. And so rather than having this oppressive idea of national identity that all Filipinos must do this, believe in this, think like this, um, and follow these images of what it means to be quote unquote makabayan, we might imagine the classroom as a space where children can play with the different messages that they have about their identity, which includes, both the colonial and the post-colonial experiences of that. So there. So I use children's books as an example. I talk about Lola Bashang books, originally told by Severino Reyes, but then retold by Christine Belen, as examples of how in our children's literature these identities have been played with. So the interesting thing about the Lola Bashang stories is that the stories take these Western concepts of fairy tales like princesses and princes and kings and then situate them in the Philippines, right? And so there's this weird, like, dislocation of colonial ideas hybridized in these children's stories that Severino Reyes told. And then you see it even in the artwork of today's versions of Lola Bashang's books, right? You see here, you know, art inspirations that come from Disney, that come from anime, right? And they all play into these works, and it's really an expression of the creative hybridity that comes with being pulled in so many directions by different identities and different cultures that impinge upon us as people from the post colony. Um, so that's it. And then my last chapter, Amor Mundi, that's I suppose what is it nga ba? Let me try to remind myself what it's about. That's basically my self-critique. That's where I try to argue against some of the dangers that might develop as a result of this educational approach that I have suggested, in the sense that questions about identity can become very insular, solipsistic questions. And so I resist that by drawing once again on Arendt's reminders about how ultimately, what she wanted to develop through her own work was not an insular, navel gazing um, reflection on what it means to be a citizen of the world, but ultimately it was a love of the world itself, right? An amor mundi. And I use that insight from Arendt to try to push back against the idea of questions about national identity becoming this, navel gazing endeavor. And that is it. And that is a summary of the 100, let me see, um, 86 pages. It's not that long. Okay, it's only 186 pages, but it felt a lot longer when I was writing it. So that's it. Thank you for listening.